Hey folks, welcome to the podcast. I've got one of my favorite guests back for another episode, and it's Andy Benfield. Andy, how are you doing?
I'm good. Zodi Cup from Bangkok. How are you? I'm sure you say that to all your guests, but I'm flattered anyway.
Well, we've known each other for a long time, so that makes a big difference. A lot of my guests I've only known for a very little time, so I do like them, but obviously not as much as I like you. So
That's true. Yeah.
um, we first spoke on the podcast in episode 45, which I'll link to in the show notes, and basically just to give everybody a little bit of background on you. I mean, you've been living an adventurous life, to put it mildly, for a long time, traveling the globe, going to a lot of third world countries, encountering some harsh conditions, violence, more, and so on. Basically, because that was your job, in part, but also that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to have fallen in love with Asia and traveling and so on. So that gives you a lot of experience about something that I want to talk about today. And to give some background on that very quickly. So Europe is in a spot of trouble with gas and electricity prices going through the roof. And just for folks who are watching this from outside of Europe, I live in Belgium. We have, like every day almost in the news, there's a story about businesses having to shut down or not knowing how they can keep going. 6 out of 10 bakers in Antwerp are about to go bust, about to go bankrupt. There was just the other day a news item about a man who bought a house 10 years ago. He heats it with electricity, and his monthly electricity bill is now about, what was it? I think 1,400 euros a month. For somebody with a normal wage, that is pretty much almost all your money is going to electricity. So we've got winter is coming. It's been exceptionally warm. It's almost November, and I'm still walking around in a t-shirt outside. So, but very quickly the cold will set in, and a lot of people will not be able to afford warming their house or their apartment. It's already happening. You already see people. There was already a bunch of deaths that a mother and daughter were trying to save money, and they warmed their apartment, I think, with a barbecue set. And then CO poisoning happened, and they both passed away. So there's going to be more of that. Now, I don't want to be Mr. Doom and Gloom all the time, which I'm sometimes accused of, rightfully so, I guess. But you've lived in harsh conditions, sub-zero temperatures and so on, and clearly survived. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that so that people understand that it is possible to live through this. And also some of the things that we risk having, which is that society tends to break down a little bit more as we enter more austere circumstances. How bad will it get? Nobody knows. Could be that this winter is fairly okay, but that next winter is horrible. Could be that this winter is horrible. We don't know. Nobody knows. So that is the basic setup of this podcast. But before we get to that, it's time for me and Andy to talk a little bit about what he's been up to since last time we talked. So you've been doing quite a lot. So what's been going on?
I also got a bit stuck. There was this pandemic thing you might have heard of, and so I got stranded. But I got stranded in Bangkok, which is of the places in the world to be stranded, not super bad. But for local people, what you were just saying about the bakers here, we've had that during COVID because the economy depends on tourism. It's Thailand. So, businesses that just couldn't go on, people having to find second, third jobs, etc. Tricky. But I eventually got out late last year. I'm still on the Yeti stuff, if you recall. So we're now making a BBC podcast. People are taking me seriously for some reason. On my search for the Yeti in the Himalayas. So that's a kind of nice new big thing. And one other thing, when I last spoke, I was linking up with some friends of mine who were trying to drive a very old Land Rover from Singapore to London. They succeeded, and actually the documentary just came out, I think 10 days ago, and the book. So maybe we can put that in the show notes. Called Last Overland. Fantastic adventure, a bunch of guys trying to take the Land Rover, which was the first car ever to drive from London to Singapore. So 60 years old, trying to get it back from Singapore to London and all their adventures on the way. So, oh, and I also qualified as a meditation teacher during lockdown. So that kept me sane. And I've now actually started playing the guitar and singing, doing gigs and stuff. You'll remember when you used to give me a lift to class, Wim, how good my singing was along to the radio. So I've taken your advice finally and gone out and done that in public. Yeah.
When you become an international pop star, please acknowledge me in your memoirs.
I promise.
And before we go on, for the listeners, I mean, do take a look at Andy's Instagram, because you'll see lots and lots of pictures of all the places he's been. I've been fortunate to travel also a fair amount in my life, not as much as you have, but a fair amount. And it's a big and beautiful world out there. Despite me focusing always on, dangers and troubles, because that's basically what this podcast is about, self-defense, staying safe, and so on. There's a lot to see in this world. And you have no idea just how much there is out there until you start seeing, information from people who are actually doing that like you. So check out Andy's Instagram. You'll see a lot of really gorgeous pictures and landscapes and some, more difficult environments to thrive in, but that's life on this planet. All right, let me see. So we talked last time, obviously, about all the things you can do to survive in these countries and so on. Could you give some examples of things that you've used, of principles that we discussed along these lines?
As I recall, one of the key ones was kind of be prepared, and a couple of great examples since we last spoke, which was just when COVID-19 was starting. So I thought that would be quite bad. So I made arrangements to get a place in Bangkok, to make sure I could stay here long term, to, pay rent up front, because we just didn't know how bad it was going to be. It turned out to be quite a lot worse the time that I just couldn't leave the country, because I wasn't, I couldn't get a vaccine here. I'm a foreigner. I was stuck. So luckily that was good. Burma, where I was living before, Myanmar, very sad military regime took over. A lot of people killed, a lot of people in prison. Friends of mine, unfortunately, are in jail there. Other friends have even lost their lives. That was something very difficult to see coming. I do have friends who did manage to get out. They took action kind of early enough when it really kicked off. So another good example there. Just those kind of surprises. The Ukraine war, we've been full of shocks, haven't we, in the last couple of years? And I was flying via Helsinki into Europe. Suddenly my flight's cancelled at the last minute, because they're like, oh, we can't be flying over Russia right now. And your flight's cancelled, we'll pay you back in a couple of months. And that's 3 days before flying. So that kind of thing of just it really pays to be prepared. And then the gray man stuff we were talking about, blending in, and how you can't do that sometimes. In Thailand, I don't look very traditionally Thai. So when COVID started, there was a thing against, in the way in Europe, people being racist against Asians, thinking, oh, you look Asian, you must have COVID. Here, the Europeans got it instead, and the Caucasians. It's like, oh, where have you come in from? You're European, you must have COVID. And those kind of challenges there, making an effort to smooth over those things with diplomacy, learning some Thai, being respectful, being deferential, that kind of thing. Another thing I talked about was bribes. I did have to use a bribe a couple of months ago, coming through an airport, again, a COVID thing, where they suddenly changed the rules and demanded a COVID test to fly out of that country, which seemed weird, because it was like, then if people are positive, you're keeping them in the country, keeping the COVID for themselves. I mean, if they have it, let them fly off somewhere else. But that was their policy. And it was one of those situations where I was about to miss a very expensive and long flight to get somewhere, and then had to find a way to convince people, of my negative COVID status in a very short time, which involved a bit of tea money and smooth talking. And then what else? Oh yeah, that was a funny one I wanted to mention. I was joking about death by Instagram last time I was on here, about people who nearly kill themselves because they take a photo trying to be on the cliff edge or something. And very nearly happened to me. So we were filming on the Yeti search up near Mount Everest. And I just come over this crazy kind of walking suspension bridge that, very, breathtaking in the literal sense, very, very scary, kind of going across a chasm. And then I was doing a piece to camera just on the cliff edge by the side of it, trying to show the viewer, how deep this gorge is and how rickety this bridge is we've just come over. And there's a nice bit of footage where I kind of slip on a rock and very nearly just kind of go over the edge. So that was a lesson to myself that, especially now with doing some filming, like doing some recording and stuff, that you shouldn't give everything to your art, including your life. So it's just maintaining that awareness and that consciousness, even when you're trying to look cool on camera or on Instagram or whatever may be. So yeah, there's a couple of little examples from the last 2 years of how to use and not use the principles.
Yeah, and I would tell people, the listeners, just go back to the first episode with Andy, episode 45, for some more fun stories of adventures around the world. It's typically one of these things that it sounds, like a fun story afterwards. But the moment itself, when you're basically looking death in the eye, or like where you realize, like, I was just about to, do like a 500-meter drop down a mountain and get crushed. It puts things in perspective. And obviously, as human beings, we move on and we go on with life. But in hindsight is always easy. But on the moment itself, it's very, very difficult to sometimes see what you're doing is just actually dangerous. I was talking to a friend of mine, and I think they were, it was in the US somewhere, I forget where, and they were doing this hike pretty high up on this rock, and he just casually saw one of his friends just almost walking and leaning over and just falling off a cliff, basically, and not getting it. And he said, you have to like stop, look where you're standing, and then she realized, like, holy crap, I'm about to kill myself. and I didn't even notice that I was doing this. So it's like you said, you've lived through this, or been in many countries and been to the Himalayas and so on, and lived there. So it's not new terrain for you. But still, anybody can make like a small mistake that you think it's fine, and a little bit, and like, oops, and then it's too late. So no matter how hard we try, we're only human. That's basically what I wanted to say.
True. Thanks.
All right. So let's get into the meat of it also, with the potential shortages that will happen in Europe. Again, there's a lot of stuff that I'm not going to go into. If you look for it, you will find a truckload of news articles that are detailing what is going on right now in Europe. There's huge companies, huge factories that are stopping production. Like, for instance, there's a big thing now about AdBlue, which is an additive for diesel cars and trucks, that it's software that regulates this in many of the current trucks and diesel cars, like mine. There's software in there, in the computer of the car, that makes it pretty much impossible to drive the car when the additive is and that tank is empty. So you have to refill it. Right. It's not hardware. You can drive without it. It's perfectly fine. But it's more polluting then. So this was regulated by the EU, if I'm not mistaken, that you need to have the AdBlue in there. But there's the risk of a shortage right now, because one of the biggest companies that makes it in Germany is basically shutting down. So there's millions of liters of this stuff that are necessary every day for just the trucks to keep rolling. No AdBlue, no trucks, no civilized society. That's what people still, right. Many people don't get it. They assume it's going to be here. It's not how it works. No trucks driving. Give it a week. All the supermarkets are empty, and that's it. You're on your own. So, will it get that far? Probably not, hopefully not, but you don't want to get close to that point. And there's a lot of stuff going on along those lines that I'm not going to get into that show how brittle the infrastructure that we need to live our modern lives is. And it's starting to break at certain points. Like I said, I saw the first €5 bread at a baker last week. €5 for a loaf of bread. It's pretty expensive. Wow. I filled up my car for the first time that it cost me over €100 to fill up one gas tank. I drive a diesel because I do many miles each month. So life is getting very expensive, and this whole mess is developing. So I would urge the listeners who are not up to speed about this, just do some research about all that's going on, so you can understand that in Europe there is a risk this winter when people will need to warm themselves, and there might be shortages of food, of supplies, and so on, and run into trouble. And that's why I invited Andrew on the show. So let's talk a little bit about that. The shortages. Let's start with that.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I was living in Kathmandu in Nepal about 10 years ago, and there was one period where we had, I think it got up to 16 hours a day of power cuts. So you only had power for 8 hours. And then there was also a petrol shortage. So it's very difficult to get hold of petrol. And then you'd cook using a kind of gas canisters connected to a stove there. That was the way we did it. And then that was running out as well. So it was, it was pretty intense. I think there's three kind of meta things. One is the planning. We know this is coming, or as you say, already happening now. No excuse not to be doing anything about it. Then there's the economizing, and then there's trying to make sure you have some kind of backup system. So in terms of the planning, being aware of what's going on, read the news. You can also set up apps that will kind of trawl Twitter or other social media and find out if someone's commenting about certain keywords, certain things in your area. So you get the news. In the places I've lived, it would be a case more like in those American cop movies of, when they go down and they get the word on the street, and you find the guy who's plugged in. So that a taxi driver who knows what's going on, some journalists, some diplomats, etc. That's that's maybe less applicable there. But if you've got friends who are informed, then make sure you're listening to what they're saying. Even setting up networks in the neighborhood or among friends as well to keep each other informed. You're not in this alone. Particularly on the let's take the fuel and the electricity or the heating, let's say. In Europe, even if you live in northern Scandinavia, you feel you have a right to kind of go around inside in a t-shirt in winter. And if it's cold, you turn up the heating. So sorry, guys, girls, but there's a mindset change here, and there's plenty of other places in the world where if there's heating, it's in one room, it's a fire, and there is simply not heat. There is not central heating, and in the mountains in northern India, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. So it's pretty simple, and it's not revolutionary. You wear more clothes at home. You wear layers. There's certain things, if it gets really bad, like merino wool skin fitting undergarment keeps you completely toasty. Basically whatever the weather. You might have to invest in extra bedding, a sleeping bag to go on there. And there's this indignation, I know, like, I shouldn't have to do this. I live in a developed country. Well, you don't anymore, sorry to say. And there are plenty of people in other places coping with this. So heating only one room, extra layers, extra clothes, good excuse to do more exercise. That keeps you warm as well. And then for the power cuts, a couple of things. In the situation in Nepal, we knew when they were coming, which was great. It wasn't random. So there was actually, the Ukrainian authorities put out something yesterday saying charge everything now, because 30% of our power stations have just been knocked out by kamikaze Russian drones. And that was a bit our attitude. So you knew it's coming on for a couple of hours, the power, everything's ready to charge. Everything's ready to go. And then you'd invest in a couple of big batteries that you charge up as well. just get some power banks so you can, you can keep your phone charged, so you can keep connected and know what's going on. You can, the next level, invest in something like an inverter, which is like a big battery that you can then connect a few things in your home too. So we decided what was essential. We said like the outside lights, the fridge, something else that gets powered off the big inverter battery when the mains goes off, because that's security and basically keeping the food fresh, kind of thing. So you could look at that stuff, buy it now, not later. The next stage up, if it gets really bad, is getting a generator, right? So that will be something that's powered by maybe diesel or petrol that's actually generating and supplying electricity. Problem there is it needs to be very big if it's going to power your whole house. And guess what? It needs fuel. So, in Nepal, it was like, well, we could buy a generator, but there's actually no fuel to run the generator off. So that's not going to really work. And then for the actual vehicle fuel, it was timing when one went to the gas station to try and do it at off-peak times. So, okay, it's 5 a.m, I'm going to the gas station. And yeah, using vehicles less, get a bike, walk. Again, it's good for your fitness. It might be, and I know that's not feasible for everyone. And you've got, listeners who are saying, well, I live, 30K from my work. Sure. But yeah, for some of the shorter trips, unnecessary trips, you have to think about, I'm going to have to start economizing now. And I mean, part of this comes down to money, because it might be there's an actual shortage, or that, as you said, there is bread in the shops, but it's €5 a loaf. So there's an effective shortage for you if you don't have that purchase.
And just to be absolutely clear, so that was one expensive loaf of bread. It was special with special grades and blah blah blah. The average price is not that, but it's not uncommon to see, bread here at €3, €3.50. That's for a more regular quality bread. The one I was looking at, that was the most expensive bread in the shop. I've never seen that in my entire life here.
So some fancy Flemish bread, okay, but still, yeah.
But it's happening. I mean, and the cost for bakers to just ply their trade and bake your bread, I mean, the energy cost is gigantic. They have to use these huge ovens and so on. Right. So they are still, even at the increased prices that they have right now, they've slowly started increasing. They're still not breaking even. They're still losing money. So there's going to be, a point at which that a lot of bakers are going to say, like, we have to close the store. That's it. We're done. We have to wait until prices come down, because we're losing too much money. It's not just not profitable. It's costing us too much to even work. Right. And as a quick aside to, what you're saying about, you have to prepare for these kind of things. It was early in this year, around the time that the Ukraine war broke out, just before that, I was actually looking at it, that we brought this small, bread maker, this one machine that you pour all the ingredients in, and it bakes the bread and so on. The price of the one that we bought just went up with about €100. So it's a lot more expensive. It's almost twice as expensive to buy it today. And the price of bread has gone up. So the recoup time that we have until we recover the cost of actually making our own bread has gone down dramatically. So a lot of this stuff is about preparation and understanding that when you see certain signs, there are logical first, second, and third order consequences that will flow out of it. Okay, how can you prepare for that without going too far into preparation mode, because that will also cost you too much money. So there's this balance that you have to find, which is hard to do. Easy to say, but very hard to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, let's move to money. I mean, I think that's such a key thing now. And I mean, just the system, the infrastructure, again, not wanting to be too scary, but in Lebanon at the moment, you can't get your money out of the bank. A friend of mine just came over from Beirut and was telling me, there's a number of stories in the news where banks have been robbed by people who are customers of those banks to get their money out. I mean, this is pretty nuts, and people are hailing
I've
them
seen
as
those,
heroes.
yeah.
Right, it's happening. I mean, slightly less extreme, but in Myanmar, limits on your ATM withdrawals, so you can only take out a certain amount from the ATM, and they're also limiting what businesses can take out the country. So I also had some investments there, and we're in a situation where you just can't get the money out of the country. So that's quite extreme. You think it won't happen this won't happen in Europe or the States. I mean, have a look if you're familiar with the UK. You've been watching the news. My country's been in it a lot recently. We almost had a kind of banking meltdown about 10 days ago. So what can we do if that happens? I'm not an advocate of taking all the money out the bank and putting it under the bed, but if you can, having a couple of different accounts if possible, having a backup credit card that you can use if things get tough, that's been very handy for me. Holding a bit of cash as well, I think is good. Normally I have cash stashed in different places. When I'm traveling in the home, I'm not going to tell you where, but remember where you keep it. So I was once stopped, little bit kind of semi-arrested. I was taken into the police station, and they wanted my international driving license. And I handed it over, and the guy opened it and then looked at me kind of confused. Thankfully, he was a very honest cop, handed me what was inside the license. And I'd completely forgotten I had a 500 euro note tucked in the back just as a safety stash. So, I looked like I was trying to pay him an extremely big bribe at that point, just handing that over to the policeman. So that was a lesson in, remembering where you keep your money. But then the planning, right? I mean, it's nice not to have to think about cash, but we all have to now. Having a spreadsheet, seeing where the money's going right now, where are there cheaper alternatives? Could I make my own bread? Do I need a $10 special Arabica blend with a double caramel shots, for my morning coffee, or could I just make one myself? This kind of stuff. And you can actually make this fun. There's a whole movement, the FIRE movement. It's Financial Independence Retire Early stands for. So there are these guys who just try to spend as little as possible in order to stop working, by 40 or something like that. And they have loads of tips and loads of ideas, and it's like, how little can I kind of spend? And they're almost gamifying it, making this into almost a fun thing, like, oh, I only spent $2 today. Like, lots of great ideas there. Friends, economies of scale. If you buy stuff together, it's cheaper. If you go down to Costco or whatever your local discount kind of warehouse retailer is, you may find some great deals if, you're buying in bulk. So get some friends together and go and do that. I mean, you can also be cooking together at the extremes. You can be sharing rooms. Happened to me in Madagascar. I was stuck on a small island. So Madagascar is a big island off the southeast coast of Africa, and a little tiny island off it. And to get to that tiny island, you have to take a boat. And that's some of the most shark-infested waters in the world. So I got to the tiny island okay. Unfortunately, the next day, one of the little boats flipped over. Everyone was very unfortunately eaten by sharks. So they banned all boat traffic between this little island and Madagascar. So we were simply stuck. Credit cards don't work there. The money ran out. So I was with met a couple of other travelers. We kind of actually, had to pull together, share rooms, share food. And, that was just what we had to do, because until we could get off that island, there was no other option. So, that is there. And I was just thinking, as you're, looking at the positives as well, in terms of activities, training, solo training, fitness training, martial arts training, apart from going to a class, even though I know your classes are very reasonably priced, this is free to do, and it makes you feel good mentally. It keeps you fit. It keeps you warm. So that, a situation like this is a great excuse to spend some more time on training and less on maybe going drinking or going to the cinema or whatever you spend money on normally. And I think you'll feel great about yourself too, right? But don't cancel your Patreon subscription.
Thank you. The thing is that this, I mean, you mentioned in the beginning, it takes this mental shift of, accepting like, okay, I am not living in, 2019 anymore, when the world was my oyster and we had this wonderful life. So
yeah,
for the most people in the West, and there were all these services that were pretty much just guaranteed. Electricity, no problems. It's cheap. It's fine, and so on. And fast forward a few years, and we're now looking at the winter coming at us, and going like, a lot of people right now are like, I don't know how I can afford both heating my place and feeding my children at the same time. It's going to be one or the other, which for a lot of people is a huge shock. It's a gigantic shock. And we'll talk about, civil unrest and that kind of stuff later. But I mean, I've mentioned this before. I, as a child, when we moved into my grandmother's house, that was an old house, and there was no central heating. So in my room, there was no real heating. So I slept in sub-zero temperatures, seeing the windows frost over completely because it was single glass panes at the time with these ventilation holes and this and that. I can still see myself lying in bed just with the covers pulled up all the way high and my breath just making this cloud above me. I'm like, this sucks, but I survived. It's fine. I mean, that it was not, forever. It was temporary, but I mean, I think I must have been like 12 or 11 back then, something along those lines. So even as a small child, like, okay, stay under the covers, stay warm. That's the whole message there. It's perfectly possible, but if you're not used to it, that shock can be really difficult, and we'll get to the mental aspects as well. But before we move on, let's say it gets particularly bad, okay, and you want to get out of wherever you are, and that it's just turning into this horrible place. Okay, what can people do?
Yeah, it depends on the resources you have. I mean, when I've lived in places where I knew there was a risk of instability in the capital, I've normally been based at least in capital cities. I had arranged like a bolt hole somewhere in the countryside where I knew I could just kind of lay low and someone to transport me there safely. At one point in West Africa, I think in Cote d'Ivoire or the Ivory Coast, where there was a coup going on and basically the airport was mobbed. So if you went to the airport, you were going to have to kind of like maybe fist fight your way through to actually get on an aircraft. And I just figured that's what everyone else is trying. It's better now just to go somewhere and lie low. In Europe or the States, that might be, your friend's house. If things do get bad enough that you're not going to be able to pay the rent, I mean, then it's right. Then that's when you're thinking about moving in together. When things get really bad, as they have, for example, for the people of Ukraine or the people of Burma, then I have friends who've had to kind of smuggle themselves out, on the cover of darkness across borders, this kind of thing. The most extreme one is my friend. He won't mind me calling him a crazy ginger Welshman because that is how he does self-identify, and so I'm just respecting his choices there. He lives in Papua New Guinea, which is a very interesting country, just kind of above Australia. For those not familiar with the Pacific, it's an archipelago, a bunch of islands, and some of them are pretty wild. And he was living on Bougainville Island when civil unrest broke out, and he just basically went in the jungle for a year and built a shack and survived there. But I mean, he had the skills to do that and the survival skills. So I'm not necessarily recommending that, but before that stage, it's the preparation, as you were saying, planning for this stuff, not being in denial. This could happen, so making adequate preparations and then staying informed about the situation as the kind of first steps, I would say.
Okay, that's great. I think we covered quite a bit on that front. I want to move on to a little bit about just how society can change along those lines. I mean, you've lived through it. I've been talking about this in podcasts, writing about this for years now, and for a lot of people, the pandemic was a sort of an eye opener, but it wasn't as bad as it can get for a lot of people as well. It was pretty bad in some areas of the world, but in many places in the West, it was still relatively good. The system didn't fully break down. Again, there were other places like in South America where it was really horrible. It's like, okay, we've got no medical services for you. You're just going to die here outside of the hospital, sitting on a bench. But this is different when we look at it. It's not a health crisis per se that we are at risk at. It's just international recession turning into an economical depression, actually, and just no money being being around as much, goods and services being too expensive, and this deterioration that happens throughout society from more or less abundance to austerity. Like I said before, a lot of people are in for a very, very rude awakening when this happens. There's going to be a lot of anger, a lot of protest also. It's actually already happening. You see the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France have been protesting, I mean, wildly, loads and loads of people in the streets. We've seen it in Germany, where there's protests against people, against the measures that the government takes. In the Netherlands, with the farmers that have been very, very much been angry, and in my opinion, rightfully so, at their government. And this kind of stuff, you've got the big manifestations, the big protests, but there's also the day-to-day stuff. If you suddenly have to pay a monthly gas and electricity bill that is 3 times what it normally is, you're going to be worried about what the future is going to be like. Will I be able to keep my apartment or my house? How will I feed my children? I just invested a lot of money in my business. If it doesn't have to be a big one, it could be a small business. You could be self-employed. You bought a new machine, a new car, a new truck, and like, I don't know how I'm going to pay for that. And if they take that away from me, then I'm messed up. I'm done for. So a lot of people will be under stress, and I want to talk a little bit about that kind of stuff. Like what's it like from your experience when society turns in that direction?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think last time we discussed a bit about, when there's a demonstration or a big riot, and some basics there, like, go away from it, which sounds so obvious, but just look at all the violence analysis videos that you've posted where there are people just standing and filming and thinking it's not going to involve them. So, I mean, that's still, very much of importance, that having those local networks, staying informed, we mentioned before. Even when it's peaceful, I mean, here in Thailand, there've been protests against the government over the last year or so. Generally very peaceful, very benign. There's students in there actually, only in Thailand, doing their homework with a lamp and in the protest. But they're still such good students. They're still doing their school homework or their university homework or whatever. They're amazing. But then someone fires a gun. And, that did happen, and you don't know who it was. Was it, there's rumors, it was this side or that side, or was someone setting up the other side? But, it happens, then there's a stampede. But on the smaller level, what you were saying, I mean, you've got a huge gas bill, you can't make the payments on your house. You're a less generous person, you're a less nice person at that point. We're all going to be. And that means people get annoyed more easily. And it means that people tend to be more biased against anyone that's different. That could be different economically. If you look like you've got money and you're doing okay, maybe not the time to flaunt that so much. It could be because you look different physically. You're from what is a minority group in that country. Had it a little bit here in Thailand because, people as a white guy, when COVID started and they didn't have it here at first, you're bringing this stuff in. So, I mean, I think this is a good lesson for the I know we're not in the subscriber only bit. I'm not supposed to swear, but can I say dick? Is that
Yeah.
okay? Or,
Yep.
yeah. Okay.
We just lost the clean rating of the podcast, so let's go all into the explicit rating.
Excellent.
So
don't
gigantic dicks.
Don't be a gigantic dick. I mean, so this was what we were talking about last time, like managing your pride, being humble, being diplomatic. This is the first line of defense, also with physical defense, right? It's not getting that. There was an article in the Guardian newspaper in the UK recently about these super preppers. So these preppers, these guys or girls who like to, who are relatively paranoid and go to a lot of lengths to prepare for shortages or apocalypse. And so there were some very rich kind of tech billionaires in the States who were planning, and they hired a guy who's like a technology journalist and expert to give them some advice. And they were saying, right, we're going to have cameras and then armed guards and this, but how can we stop our guards, muting? Should we have another guard for the guard? And he was like, kind of, well, number one, partnership and solidarity are really important as well. And it reminded me when I lived in Ethiopia, I lived next to an area of, very low cost temporary housing. I mean, what would in the old days you would call a slum. That, I don't want to often used in a derogatory way. It was low cost temporary housing. I lived in a house with a nice garden that happened to be located there. So I did make an effort to go and meet my neighbors, to get to know those people, because I was aware there is an economic disparity here. And, if I was them, I might be tempted one day, hopefully, if they know me, this is kind of less likely. So I think that's just a really key thing, managing, and we'll talk a bit more about that, the mental health stuff, like, managing anger, managing how you are, and what your reactions are.
I'm just going to quickly interject because, I know some preppers that I want to defend the prepping community a little bit.
Please, yes. I'm not anti-prepping.
Please, I know.
Anyone...
But somebody in the prepping community will listen to this and start yelling at the screen or at their phone as they listen to the podcast. So, to put this in perspective, the prepper community is wide-ranging. There's a whole variety of people in there. Some people who are indeed paranoid a little bit and go over the top and so on. And we've all seen examples in, there's a bunch of movies where you can see this kind of stereotype of the prepper that is portrayed. Fine, those people do exist. On the other end of that spectrum are very sensible, reasonable people who make certain choices about how to prepare for problems in life. Now, we all do that to a certain degree. I mean, who listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube is going to say that they have nothing in the house to eat or drink? Nothing, like zero food, zero water, nothing. Most people have something. A lot of people have, quite a pantry already that they've basically built up over time. That is prepping. That is a form of prepping in which you prepare for, we might be out of whatever it is, oatmeal that you need. So I'm going to buy a bunch and fill up that stock as needed. And then there's varying degrees in how far you go with that kind of stuff. We all do to some degree. The thing is that what I think is what most people from the outside looking at the prepping community see is that, it looks like they're always preparing for the biggest catastrophe, the Armageddon scenario, and so on. Well, some people, but a lot of people are like, we see what's going on, and we want to be prepared for that and not suffer the consequences of bad decisions by politicians and so on. For instance, Europe, all of a sudden, electricity is extremely expensive because Europe decided to implement certain policies that created this problem. They can talk about, the war and this and that. And yes, the war in Ukraine is a part of why gas and electricity prices are so high, but by far not the only reason, by far. So some people saw that coming and decided to try to prepare for that. And that's what I think is a lot what we're talking about is you don't have to go to the extreme. You have to go as far as you are maybe financially able to, and comfortably, psychologically, you don't want to go all in necessarily. You're going to have to find that balance. But it does make sense to, when you see all these things happening in society and in the news, like, okay, how can I prepare for that? Especially if you're a parent, you will start to worry about your children and worry about, okay, how can I keep them safe? How can I make sure they don't freeze to death? How can I make sure they have food every day? Well, that's what preparing is all about. Anyway, that was a little bit of a parenthesis that I wanted to give before the community goes nuts.
I'm not rallying against prepping. I'm saying include in your prepping the social aspect of building friendships, being nice to people, not being a dick, having a good community. It's going to feel nice. And, there's people there that'll help you out when something happens. But by all means, the attack dogs, the cameras, the landmines, yes, absolutely. But also, be nice to the neighbors and the armed guards is,
And like you said, your friend just says, I'm going to live in the jungle for a year. You said he has the skills to do that. Not everybody has that. Not everybody lives in an area where that's even possible. So a lot of the preparation, a lot of what I think a good prepping community is about is community, establishing relationships. Like you said, don't be a dick to everybody, get along, pool your resources, and so on, which is how human beings have been able to survive for millennia, is by working together. Not by constantly having strife and war and conflict, but by collaborating. Because, as I like to say, we live in a hostile universe. The only planet we know of where human life is possible right now is this one. There's a lot of them out there. And on this planet, the planet actively tries to kill you 24/7. You don't survive on this planet unless you have shelter from the elements, unless you have water, unless you have food, and so on. And humanity has clawed its way out of potential extinction many, many times, in the sense of that you have to work together. If as a quick example, I think it was in the Middle Ages, for every person not working to create food and society, there had to be like 12 or 15 people doing the work for them. So that's how difficult life was. You needed 12 to 15 people doing work for one guy to say, what? I'm rich enough to not have to bother with that. Others will do it for me. We've inverted that in the Western modern world. It's pretty much inverted. We've got machinery, we've got big industry, we've got technology that allows us to live this comfy life where a lot of people don't have to worry about just putting food on the table. Okay, I'm going to stop ranting. Over to you.
Well, that was the people stuff. But I guess the other side of the people stuff is the about yourself as a person. We're talking about being good to other people, building up good relations, and is that psychology, that kind of mental health angle, and it's something I've had to consider quite a bit. Both, I'm in the same situation like the rest of us, apart from I don't have a heating problem. I'm going to have a cooling problem if I can't afford to pay the energy bills here. And you would think that people will laugh at that, but when I lived in Delhi, it could be 35 degrees at night, and it was a dread to wake up and not hear the air conditioning unit, because it meant there'd been a power cut. You open the windows, nothing happens, it gets hotter. And I personally know people who had to throw out mattresses, the night after something like that happened, because you just sweat, and it was pretty awful. So heat can be bad too. Anyway, I digress. So studying to be a meditation teacher in the last 2 years, and a very practical course with the University of California, it brings in a lot of psychology and kind of mental health stuff, which was great during lockdown. And you realize, a lot of people spend, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners, a lot of time, energy keeping the body fit, but maybe not the mind, which is needed, because we have an inherent negativity bias, even if right now I think we're being quite reasonable. And yes, there are problems ahead, but we tend to spend a lot of time worrying and a lot of energy on that, rather than solving things, on worrying about them instead. So there's a couple of good tricks that they teach you, just to keep the spirits up on a daily basis is that there is nice stuff happening. If you look around, you try and find a few things each day to be, thankful for. Could be the birds in the trees. It could be your partner. It could be that you still have a computer and a Netflix subscription. I don't know. And then the comparing that we tend to always compare to the situation that we would want to be in. Not well, it could be worse now. It could be a lot worse. And for me, it's maybe easier to say because I've lived in places and known people who have, who are in terrible situations. I have a couple of good friends who are in jail right now, in the neighboring country to where I'm sitting, in terrible conditions. We're not in a European or an American jail, in a Burmese one. And I think about that, and it's like, okay, I'm a little less stressed now about my difficulties. And what you said earlier, resilience of humans is amazing. So it's fear. You said this on one of your podcast episodes before, is always about the future. It's about worrying about what might happen and how will I cope with that. Our resilience is amazing. You can and you will. I mean, that's not an argument to not prepare, but it's an argument to spend your energy on, okay, what can I change here? What can I not change? What is in the realm of what I can do something about? And let's focus on that. And the other stuff, if I can't do anything, I can contingency plan maybe, but let's spend the energy on this. And you will, remarkable, can make a remarkable transformation. It also makes you much more creative. You're saying, okay, this has happened. This situation is here. My disposable income has gone down, but I am going to cope. And is there some way, I can make this better or use this? And there's also, I now I'm teach say practical, just breathing techniques, to stay calm if it all gets too much. And, there's basic things you can do, basic kind of techniques and tricks to just help keep your head above water. And you're not alone, as we've kept saying here, you're not alone. And that, that should help. Other people are in the same boat. I mean, there's even a perverse, I lost some money on investments recently, and I read about the owner of the Peloton exercise bike brand who just lost, I don't know, 300 million or something. So it was, I didn't lose quite that much. So it was just, there was a perverse satisfaction there, in that, well, we are in the same boat. Other people are suffering too. And, we can help each other through it. And then that old eternal piece of wisdom to keep you sane in good and bad times, which is this too will change. This is, I know, especially if you're younger, COVID, Ukraine, inflation, come on, enough already, but I give it another couple of years. I'm sure it will be better. If not, you can have me on again and complain that I gave everyone false hope. But,
No, I think it's fair. I mean, it's there's this saying over here in Dutch is kijk naar de mindere en gij zult getroost zijn, which if I'm not mistaken comes from the Bible. Right. But it's look at the lesser person, the one lesser than you, and you will be comforted. Which basically means that look at somebody who's in a whole lot worse situation than you are, and you will be comforted that, well, maybe I don't have it as bad. That doesn't mean that what you have is great. That's not what it means. No. It means that you have to find a way to get through whatever it is that is going on. Eventually there will come an end to it. How long will it take? Nobody knows. How bad will it get? Nobody knows. But if you focus only on the negative, there's a high chance that you're just not going to make it, or that you're going to make decisions out of negative emotions, out of fear, anxiety, stress, and so on, that will cause more problems for you and actually make your situation a whole lot worse. Like we just said, like a lot of people get to be stressed out because of what's going on. And then all the little things that cause friction in daily life suddenly become a bigger deal. Somebody bumps into your shoulder on the street, you're in the supermarket, somebody grabs the last can of whatever you wanted, and so on. And very, very easily, because you're already so much stressed out, you end up in a shouting match or actual violence, which we saw happen during COVID. there were fights on the supermarket parking lot over toilet paper over here. I posted one of my virus analysis videos. Was this guy? There's this argument with an elderly lady that he has at the checkout counter of a supermarket, and he throws this big bag of, what was it, fertilizer at her. I mean, that's like an assault on an elderly lady because of something she said to him. I forgot the details, but all that kind of stuff is going to be cranked up to a higher degree. It's right. Like the heat is getting put higher on the pot, and the water starts to bubble a little bit. It's not boiling over yet, but it's a lot more pressure. You need to release that pressure. Like you said, meditation is great, working out is great, breathing exercises, all these things can definitely help, but you have to do the work. And that starts by understanding that, right, this is going to take a while. It's not going to be over in a week. So I have to manage myself. You made that point excellently. A lot of people think about physical fitness, but not mental fitness, resiliency, being able to withstand the harsh times that you're living through for the long term, not just for a few weeks, but maybe for months or years on end.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's people, one thing maybe helps people to get it sometimes is people are familiar with often how you deal with grief. They've heard these things, right? They know, oh, that thing when someone dies, and the first thing is like denial and shock, and I just can't compute. And the next is kind of anger, and then there'll be kind of melancholy, and then, you know, finally there's kind of acceptance. And it's actually very similar mechanism to other external shocks, you know, in plain English. Oh, suddenly I don't have any money anymore and everything's super expensive, and, you know, what just happened here, and my government's no longer taking care of me, and I can't feed my kids and keep the heat on. And it's, yeah, understanding that's a natural response and reaction, and kind of getting through to the acceptance bit as soon as possible. And again, as you said, not that I'm not trying to change it, but that it is what it is for now. And I'm choosing to spend my energy on, you know, trying to do something about it, and not getting, you know, trying not to be kidnapped when those bad feelings come, and they just want to take you into depression, or say, well, let's start drinking or taking drugs or whatever your vice is, which is actually going to, you know, cost more money for a start and not help you in the long term. But good point what you said, because we were talking about other people having short fuses. Yeah, it could be you as well, that you are the one not just offending someone else, but you're going and throwing a bag of fertilizer at someone, and then you're ending up in jail. I mean, so yeah, another good reason to meditate, because it means less fertilizer bag throwing at old women. Guaranteed.
What I always like to do is I still use Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid, which is a little bit antiquated, and there's, you know, we can talk about, you know, how scientifically speaking it might not be the best model, but as an image, as a way to wrap your head around this, I think it's still valid. And he basically, you know, I think it's the original pyramid was like 5 levels. The lower levels support all the levels that go on top of it, and the lowest level is just, what do you need to exist? You need food, you need air, you need water. You need shelter, you need clothing, and so on. You need the stuff to basically not die because of exposure, and you don't have your physical needs met. And once you get that in order, you get to safety. That's the next level, and that is just basically all the things you need to do so you can get beyond the next day. It's not just, okay, right, do I have food for tomorrow, but I'm going to set myself up. So I've got my own house. There's money coming in. I can buy food and so on. And that stabilizes that bottom layer. And once you have that, then you can start focusing on your relationships. Typically, that means finding a partner, but it's also family and friends and so on. That becomes more important. And once you get that in order, then we get to, I think you call it respect or esteem, I'm not sure anymore, which is basically your status in the world and your interaction with a bunch of other people. But the top level, which you can only basically focus on if all the other levels are met, is self-actualization, which is, who are you in the world? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind, and so on? And you want to be, you know, the best version of you, and do great things, and so on. I'm a little bit exaggerating and simplifying, But this is a really good model, I think, or image, or I don't know, metaphor, however you want to call it, for what we've been talking about. And that is, for a long time, for years on end, many people, increasingly more people in Western countries have been able to live at that top level, the two top levels: esteem, respect, getting respect, status, and self-actualization, doing things in the world and becoming the best you.
Yeah.
If they never understood how fragile everything is that is necessary for you to live on those levels, that is a harsh shock to the system to all of a sudden get kicked all the way down to the lowest levels of, I need food for tomorrow, I need to have a house, I don't have a job anymore. And all the other things that are on those higher levels tend to go away or they get to be put under stress. And that is what you said in the beginning, just don't be a dick. It starts with that, from a community, so that you can put resources and so on, but don't be an asshole, because you will be more likely, it's more likely that you're going to be an asshole to people because you're under so much stress to just have your basic necessities covered. And that mind shift, like, don't look at everybody else, look at yourself first. What am I doing to aggravate the situation here? Am I a part of the solution? Am I a part of the problem? You're not perfect. Right. Nobody is. Yeah. And then we get to outrage culture, the woke stuff that I've been nagging people all about, is that if your identity and your world revolves around all these kind of issues, these social issues and so on that you think are so important, I'm not saying they're not, but that's what you're focused on, and you're very much outraged, you have grievance studies, that is what you major in, fine. You have to understand that what is going on right now will end up in a situation where the average person is going to say, shut the fuck up about that stuff. I'm trying to feed my kids. I don't care about your issue, your social issue. My kids are hungry. We're getting kicked out of the house. We can't heat our place. And it's freezing. Getting kicked all the way down to the lower levels means that accessing those higher levels becomes a very low priority for most people. If that's been your life, that's what you've been been focusing on, make that shift now. Mental shift, make it now before you need it. Hopefully, we'll never get to that point. Hopefully, winter in Europe will be fine, and there's going to be gas and electricity for everybody. Prices go down, it'll be awesome. If not, you're going to have to make that mental shift, that paradigm shift, basically very, very quickly. And I wish you the best of luck, because it's hard. All right, that was a rant. Yeah. Your time to rant, Andy. Yeah. Just don't hold back.
I'm done with my ranting. I think the point with the hierarchy of needs is useful. You can have, some of them are free. So, the sense of community and connection, which is the kind of the reason to living before the level of, what's my legacy for the world and the self-actualization. But for most people, those connections are quite important. And, again, something to be thankful for. Talking actually about economizing and sharing, it can be that, you're hanging out more in friends or family's houses, then there's only one house to heat. And again, you're cooking together, this kind of thing. And that gives you the social contact, because what can happen, a lot of people these days in Western countries live alone. More than in 50 years ago. Huge rates of kind of solo occupancy. And then it's like, well, I've got no money to go out. And that's when I see friends, and they're kind of cutting off, and that can be quite dangerous as well. COVID, of course, that was enforced, but now it's not. Thankful we don't have lockdowns anymore, mostly. Taking care of the basic needs, but doing that in a way that involves other people is going to save money, and it's also going to make you feel better and satisfy one of the higher levels of the pyramid as well. So that's a good thing to do. Again, for the training, go out, instead of going to the pub with your mates, go and do some Tai Chi with them, or cook a meal together, whatever, make some bread.
I think that's a really good point. And you can speak from that experience that in many of the third world countries, or countries where society is a lot more austere. Is that a family unit, family structure is so much more important. Is it just the idea of just, I'm just going to go live by myself is like, no, because you won't make it, because the environment doesn't allow for that. There's no welfare necessarily that you can rely on. There's no government checks coming. It just isn't there. If you want to survive, you have to stay with the family, or the extended family, or the community, the small community, which could be a few houses around you, could be your whole street or the block you live in, could be the small town, could be you and a few neighboring towns. I mean, it could be a bunch of stuff depending on where it is. But it's this idea of the lone survivor is the hardest way to get through difficult times, I think.
Which is such a Western kind of construct, and in the West, generally a very individualistic, independent attitude, which is exactly what we don't need right now. It's me, I'm Rambo against the world. And when people come to countries where, incomes are lower, standards of living, maybe, as you say, more austere, they often say, as I did, oh, people are so friendly here in Madagascar or in Laos or in Papua New Guinea. Is it just that they're more friendlier people? And my take on that, having seen it, having traveled a bit, is like, part of it is for sure necessity, that because you can't make it on your own, you do help each other. So you cook more together, you help each other harvest the rice when it's their turn. Matey's lost his job, we'll lend him some money. We'll have a banking circle among friends because we can't get access to formal financial services. This, of course, breeds community and taking care of each other. And the motivation may be, I don't know, completely selfish, and that's the only way to survive. But it's a nicer way to live, generally, I find. And just that, there is that sense of people taking care of each other. And it's something I think Europe and the States are maybe going to have to relearn a little bit, perhaps, in the next couple of years. That you're not the hero, the action movie hero, making it all on your own. It's not possible. You're not Bruce Willis.
Well, and again, you've got the example of your friend going to live in the jungle for a year. So we're not saying it's impossible. We're saying for the vast majority of people, that's not the best way to go. You're making it so much more difficult for you. It's already going to be hard if this is all new to you, but don't make it harder than it needs to be. And in that regard, again, community, friends, family, and so on, pooling resources is I think the most important thing to I wouldn't say guarantee success, but just make it so much more easier for everybody, including yourself. A final question I want to ask is, we've been going for about an hour, and I know we have to keep time in check a little bit. You've lived in for extended periods of time, sometimes in these places where life is pretty tough for the average person, and then you go back to the Western world. So I'm guessing there's a little bit of not necessarily a shock, but just a mode switch, mostly in mindset and in habits and so on. But you've done this plenty of times, so you've got a bunch of experience with that. You just mentioned it earlier. This too will pass eventually. Let's take a bad case scenario. It gets really bad in Europe this winter. Lots of civil unrest. I mean, Berlin, the mayor of Berlin actually said, I think it was last week, like, we're looking at power cuts for about 3 hours every day. That's freaking Berlin. which is a modern city in a modern country in the West. So, and this is not idle talk. It's no longer because one of my students is German and he follows us closely. We talk about this a lot. So it's not a matter of if there will be power cuts and blackouts. It's when and how bad will they get. That's what they're looking at. So if you live in a part of Europe where it's actually not that bad, good for you. But there's going to be people for whom it's pretty bad. But eventually, life will get better. Do you have any tips or thoughts to share on that? How do you switch from this difficult lifestyle back to a lifestyle where things are better again? And I'll give you the example of my grandmother. When she passed away, she lived through the First and Second World War. when she passed away and we emptied out the house, there were, I mean, I can't count the numbers of cartons of milk. I can't count the pounds of soap and rags that she had, which she would never be able to use in her lifetime. But hoarding is like living through a world war where a lot of stuff is not available. It's like never again was her mindset. And I was a child when that happened. And I remember us cleaning the house and being there. And it's like, why did grandma need all that stuff? And it didn't make sense to me then until obviously much later. We're like, okay, no, she was preparing for the next time it would happen. And a lot of people in Europe said, it's never going to be war again in Europe. And I'm like, ask the Ukrainians how they feel about that.
Right.
So any tips on switching back to quote unquote normal mode?
It can be tricky. Of course, it's nice. I mean, because everything in life is relative. It's what you're used to. So if you live in a 5-star hotel the whole time, that becomes normal, and you don't appreciate it pretty much at all. You have to go and then live somewhere else and come back. I mean, when I used to do it a lot, at one point I was based in Brussels and doing, I'd do a trip to Africa for 2 weeks, then come back, then be in the Pacific for a couple of weeks, then be in South America or whatever. And I just flipped back in mode because it's also things like security protocols. Can I drink the water or not? I know I can in Belgium, but I can't in Burkina Faso. And just what was normal. When I was here in Thailand for like 2 years, not able to move, my first trip was to Kathmandu, Nepal, which is very different from Bangkok. And it was a shock. And I had that thing again, like oh my God, this is really, and then when I came back to Thailand afterwards, it was like, oh wow, this is amazing. That's basically a nice thing to look forward to. Some things in you though will have changed because you have lived through it. So yes, you'll appreciate things more. You will have some additional resilience for sure when stuff happens. But you may carry with you some habits of being a bit more careful. If you've got to the situation where you couldn't nearly feed yourself or your family, you may develop some hoarding tendencies. I had a situation once. This is when I didn't adjust very well to the coming back. I'd flown back in from I think Sierra Leone in West Africa to Singapore. Was in a nice hotel and then got woken up by explosions under fire, rolled out of bed, took cover, grabbed the phone, called the hotel reception, like, right, there's shelling outside, what's going on? And there was a pause and they said, sir, it's Chinese New Year, there are fireworks. And I suddenly realized I'm in Singapore, I'm no longer in Sierra Leone, I have now left. And, so those kind of things can affect. I mean, I can no longer really live in a normal house after having a couple of home invasions. I just don't sleep, even if I've got all the security stuff. So I now live in very secure places.
Instead of just idly mentioning this, I had a couple of home invasions. You do realize that for most people, a home invasion is exceptional. One. Having multiple...
That's still exceptional. It's not happening to me every day.
So, and as a quick aside, for the listener and for the audience, I mean, look how Andy is joking about this, and I've known about this obviously because he's told me before. But this is a big part of mental survival is being able to laugh things off. Not like I'm ignoring that it happens, but just after a while, it's like that was a crazy thing that happened to me, and you joke about it because it's a way to cope with the stress and sometimes the trauma even is moving.
But I no longer
go ahead.
I no longer stay in a house, so it's not that it had no effect. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I mean, that's happened in 2 different continents to me. After the first time, it was super home security. It was his and hers with my ex-partner, pepper sprays on the bedside tables and batons in the bedroom, and not. I know how that's sounding, and I know your mind. For self-defense purposes, you're right. To be very clear, and then it happened again. I wasn't there at that time, and my partner at the time was at home, calling me after someone trying to get in the house and saying, "Right, you're barricade in the bedroom. You've got the pepper sprays there." So we actually did need that stuff. But yeah, the effect is now that I even if I'm in quite a safe place, I do find it difficult not to be. Yeah, I do change my security standards, psychology, alert level, but there's some things that still I can't quite let go of, and that one really damaged me. And I got you know the story. I got attacked once on a motorbike by four guys ambushing me, and yeah, that for quite a while still. When I was on a bike somewhere in a rural area, I'd get flashbacks and get quite, you know, nervous if there were people coming near the roadside, that kind of thing. So it's going to be nice when it gets better, but yes, and you'll be more resilient. But there may be some residual damage depending on how bad things go. But again, yeah, all the meditation stuff helps with that, dealing with your thoughts and emotions, not always believing them, being self-compassionate, and yeah, sense of humor. I always think I often use it very inappropriately at the wrong time, but generally, that's a good thing to be able to laugh at yourself and others and home invasions. Yes. So.
Well, and I'll have to look it up again. I don't recall the exact episode that I had Alexis Artwell on, who is a psychologist who wrote a book with Lauren Christensen, Deadly Force Encounters, and then wrote a follow-up book on that, a new edition. I still want to get her back on the show. And one of the things she writes about is that the average person has post-traumatic stress syndrome when something serious happens for about 3 weeks, and then they get back to their regular lives, which doesn't mean that it's just like pretend it never happens. No. What it means is that there's on average 3 weeks where things are pretty bad, but then if you do the right things and so on, and you get counseling, you get treatment, you take care of yourself and so on, you go back to a more normal version of your mindset from before. Like you said, it's not that every time you go into a house that you're going to stay there, that you're panicking like we're going to get invaded again. But it's also not that you can ignore the safety measures that you normally take that actually have a proven track record in keeping you safe against that. You can't, it's not either or. It's like you said, you scale up and down the security measures depending on where you are. And I think that's a big part of it is understanding that, okay, I lived through this horrible thing. I'm not going to let it define me. I'm not going to let it control me for the rest of my life. Saying that is not the same thing as saying pretend it didn't happen. What it means is that you've got an ongoing struggle now, maybe, or just a process in your mind that is going to maybe want to pull you back down into that trauma or towards that negativity, which you're going to have to manage. But in the meantime, your life will not wait for you to be ready for that. It's going to keep going on until it ends eventually. So that this idea of resiliency and anti-fragility, that what doesn't break you actually makes you stronger, to oversimplify it, is I think an important mindset for people to have if things do get to be pretty bad here in Europe and in other places this winter. Think of the long term. There will be an end to it, and you eventually you're going to have to shift to a different mindset again.
Yeah. That was a Nietzsche, right? Who said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Because I think it was Nietzsche. I had a flashback because it's also the slogan, or used to be, of one particular Egyptian brand of beer. And I was in a very basic backstreety place and in Cairo years ago. And I remember getting served this, and it had this written on the bottle, the bottle was kind of quite dirty as well. And it was like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I was like, what are the chances either way when I drink this beer of, those two options? Just flashbacks to me very clearly. Sorry.
Being Belgian and having Belgian beer at my fingertips, I'm going to say that it's very poor advertising of that Egyptian beer brand. Yeah. It's all very smart. But in all fairness to them, we have a beer called Mort Subite, which means sudden death in French. So I don't know.
Subite, yes. Yeah.
Maybe they're onto something. Who knows?
What's going on?
All right. Anything else you want to add, Andy? Any thoughts before we close off?
No, I think we covered it pretty well there. I mean, I couldn't, when you brought this up, I said to you as a subject for the podcast was like, well, I've not lived through fuel and gas shortages in Europe. I've done it in a very different context. But then you were like, yeah, but the point is no one has, unless you interview an 88-year-old guy who was World War II, but then so many other things have changed since then. And so hopefully some things are applicable from my experience, but other things won't be, because it's still, if for listeners who are in, a more developed economy, whatever, it's going to be a slightly different situation. So I hope that, like Bruce Lee, take what's useful and,
Yep, I think that applies to every single thing I say, write, or podcast that I do. Is that if there's even one thing you can get out of it, I mean, I'm pretty sure that just for most listeners, this episode it's going to be more than one thing, but just use whatever you can. And if you're like, you know what, I tried this one thing and it really worked out, it helped me out, awesome. Then we've done our jobs. And if at the end you say, you know what, all this is nonsense, what they're saying, I'm going to do it differently, and that works for you, that is awesome as well. I'm all for it. It's a pretty big world out there, and listen to as much advice as you can, and then make your own decisions and come to your own conclusions.
Yeah, your personal situation is going to be different. Your country situation, so a lot of variables, right? But some commonalities as well. The differences are as important as the similarities. There's some guy who loves going on saying that a lot.
I have no idea what you're talking about for sure.
A mug with it on. Yes.
Sorry, we touched upon it a little bit in the intro, but what's next for you? What do you want to next? And before we talk about that, where can people reach you? So that is the most important thing.
I think just the Instagram is easiest. Just DM me their particular bear.
I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you. It's quite exciting time. I've had this fascination with the legend of the Yeti in the Himalayas for years, and suddenly some people got interested in it. When we last spoke, I think we'd met this TV director. One thing led to another. We now have a BBC deal, initially for a podcast. I hope it will develop also into a book and a TV series. But what I do know is that in 2.5 weeks, they are sending me and my more skeptical friend to Bhutan, and we'll be there for about 15 days, meeting interesting people who say they have seen strange creatures in the mountains. We'll be doing a bit of trekking, bit of camping out, no doubt taking a few risks because it will make for a good podcast. So yeah, that's the kind of big thing I'm working on at the moment. And then along with that, as I say, getting into the kind of meditation, practical meditation teaching, combining that with sometimes with some of the Tai Chi martial arts teaching as well. So yeah, in a nutshell, some other things going on, but yeah, they're the highlights that you'll see on my Instagram.
and again, I'm gonna ask everybody to follow Andy on Instagram and check out his feed there. Lots of fun stuff. The image that I used to announce the podcast was you sitting on top of a Jeep somewhere in the Himalayas when I was driving around. I think that was with the drone footage that you were testing, maybe.
This was again. So when all the criticism I did last time of Death by Instagram, when you're filming or recording, I do stuff, and it was my cameraman's fault, who was like, it'll be a really fun if we this is a really rough road with a big drop, and I'm kind of, sitting on the top of the vehicle. He did another one on a very narrow bridge with a line of yaks, notoriously large, powerful, and skittish animals, coming across because the shot would look nice. And I have to balance this a bit better before we get to Bhutan, because it's just going to be like, let's climb to the top of that, mountain and see what we can see from there, because that would sound really good. And then, oh dear, we need a helicopter to rescue us.
Yeah, TV people.
I've got some work to do.
Yeah, and producers and cameramen, camera people, and so on. They have their own idea of what obviously gets you the best shot, but that isn't necessarily a great idea to do that.
I'm sure with your videos, there's time where they've been risking your physical health by demanding repeats.
Well, I'm fortunate in all the videos I make now, in my instructional videos and so on, is that I am the producer, cameraman, and director. So I get to decide what actually happens. I'm 50, so I'm at an age where the consequences of doing all that silly stuff that I used to do, the dangerous stuff, is that the consequences aren't worth it anymore. So people will just have to take my word for it when I do something and say something. But I'm not going to do those jumping 360 kicks in which you fall flat on the ground to crush somebody's skull lying there, as supposedly the technique was meant to be. So those days are gone. Now I'm an old man yelling at clouds.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for taking the time, Andy. I know you're busy and you've got a lot on your plate right now, so I appreciate it a lot, and I hope the listeners will find all the hard-won, the hard-earned information and experience that you share with us. There's a lot of it, and the only thing I want to say is like I stopped you like once or twice, like, hold on, let's expand on this, because in your very own British way you tend to gloss over like, oh, I was home invaded a few times, and then as if it's nothing. But there's a bunch of times where I almost interrupted you that I think the listener will, if they pause the podcast for a second and think about it, like, he's just said something pretty profound here. Maybe I have to think about it a bit longer. So, like, this is worth investigating, as opposed to just casually moving on to the next thing, which is, the typish, the stiff upper lip that you British guys have. So me being Flemish, I'm very different to you, as you well know, especially my sense of humor is messed up. But I want to thank you for taking the time. Do keep me informed, and I will let people know when the podcast series with the BBC airs, because that'll be fun to listen to. I mean,
next March, 10 episodes, us roaming around the Himalayas, finding some pretty. I mean, this is not just a joke bullshit thing. I mean, there is something very weird going on, and we do think there is not what you might think of as a Yeti, but there is some different type of species up there. I'm pretty convinced now.
Yeah, and I'm just going to quickly mention it that you spoke at, what is it, the London or the British Museum about this?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke at the Royal Geographical Society, which is the premier. This is where Edmund Hillary spoke after he climbed Everest, for example. It's where Shackleton after the Antarctic expedition. So if they're taking me seriously to go and give a speech in London, then so should everyone else. Yeah,
I'm just going to say two words: DNA sample. That's it, people. Look it up. Look up at his Instagram, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
It's a bit of a hairy situation.
All right, dude. Thank you so much. This was awesome. And everybody else listening,
thank you.
As always, thank you. Hit the like button, share, subscribe, follow me on Patreon for a bunch more, including a bonus episode with Andy from a previous podcast. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, cheers.